Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today is probably going to be the most geeky episode there will ever be. I've mentioned before that one of my greatest guilty pleasures is Star Trek tie-in fiction. I dispute the term guilty pleasures. There's just pleasures. Guilty doesn't come into it. I'm not that bothered about Star Trek on TV, I have to tell you, and I've not even kept up with all the recent iterations, not least because they're on weird channels that we don't get. And they don't quite hit the spot in the way that some of the old Star Treks do. So this is my little video. I'm going to try not to go on too long about the things that I love about Star Trek. I don't even know how to define it. There's something particular. I guess, to me, the whole show is a workplace-based comedy. That's what it's always been. And I didn't really become a Star Trek fan until I was about 14. Exactly 14, actually. What I remember is the spring of 84, and The Search for Spock was about to come out of the pictures, and I knew that they'd killed off Spock in the previous movie, and I was fascinated that a series would do that. My hair's sticking up weird. Never mind. And Newton Aycliffe Town Library, which is the locus of so many of my bookish stories, this tiny, prefabricated, blocky building, not very big, on the edge of our town centre. I'd gone through the children's section like crazy, and I'd read all the Doctor Who's in W.H. Allen hardback. I'd read loads of the kids' fiction. I'd read all of the non-fiction, because when my dad would take us on access weekends, he wouldn't let us go to the fiction section because fiction was, quotes, for girls. And so we could only take out books about science and geology and evolution and history and fighting and sport. That's all he'd let us take out. So I used to sneak out to the library myself after school and get fiction. I went through Doctor Who. And then at 14, I discovered the science fiction section of Aycliffe Library. And that's when I discovered the Star Trek books. And it happened to coincide with a reprinting program that was going on. That's dusty. But first of all, these were the editions that I read from first of the James Blish series of adaptations from the TV. Just look at them. They were the most perfect books I'd ever seen. He would take 7 or 8 of the episodes and do them as short stories and make them tight and make them make sense and make them fun. And he'd introduce each one with a letter to the fans, where he would talk to them as a fan and respond to their questions. It was a kind of fan forum at the front of each book. Very welcoming books. And in 84, Corgi Books started reprinting the series with new covers by Chris Archilios. Now, I used to have all of these, and they all went astray, like all my books did, many years ago when I left home. And I've had to kind of rebuy some of them. I'm still missing certain ones. I need to go on eBay, and I need them in this edition. The Chris Archilios covers, as iconic as his Doctor Who book covers of the decade before. What a wonderful artist he was. I met him briefly at a Doctor Who convention and kind of stammered out my thanks. There's Star Trek 1. These were £1.80 when they came out. Star Trek 2, that is the most evocative of all the covers, I think, with that image from City on the Edge of Forever, which is still, to me, the greatest Star Trek story. My Star Trek 3 is not a very good cover, a kind of 70s cover. And then I jump to, I'm missing 4 and 5, and there's Star Trek 6. These remind me of going to Sunderland and Jarrow and Newcastle at the weekend and scouring all the bookshops for these, because they weren't very well stocked in places. and going to places like Time Slip in Newcastle, the science fiction bookshop by the bus station. What's that? 9. And these, another 9. These are the older editions, which were so dull in their covers. But these, they'd be worth collecting just for the covers, I think, this edition. And another boring 11, and then a wonderful 12 from the Achilleos series. So maybe I should apply myself to eBay and buy up the rest. I think my favourite of all of these was probably 12, because of the lovely letter that both Blish and his widow, because he dies in the middle of writing book 12, put at the beginning of the book, and also because it finishes with Shore Leave, the episode that involves Alice in Wonderland, which was always one of my favourites on TV. And the fact that they saved it till last is always kind of pleasing. It's a bit like Doctor Who stuff, where they always seem to save Terror of the Zygons till last when they adapt or release things, because that's the best as well. At about that stage in 84, I got this, which was magic. And I think published by, well, not quite Target Books, but almost. And it was the first non-fiction book I got about Star Trek. First and last, really. And really it's about the making of the 60s show and how they struggled to get it on and to keep it on and to try and bring it back. And there's lovely stuff here about 60s TV, and the photos were magical as well, because I hadn't seen all of these. And I suppose now it's a bit old hat, but at the time, I think because I knew Doctor Who inside out and I knew all of that stuff, this all felt fresh. And so I couldn't wait to see all these episodes, which they then started repeating, I think, on TV about that time. Also at that time, these started coming out in 84. This is the collected volume that I got in recent years of the DC Star Trek comic, which began between films 2 and 3. Looking for the credits. It was written by Mike W. Barr and drawn by Tom Sutton and Ricardo Valagran. Those are the names I remember seeing on these comics, and there was something wonderful about all of it. Spock being missing still, and Sarvik coming in as a main character. But they were building this extended universe that drew upon the 60s mythology of the show. That's what I liked. Anyway, Socks has come to sit on my lap. Come on, Socks. You're not bothered about Star Trek, are you? I've also managed to collect up these in recent years. They're really battered, and they were probably too expensive in the shops that I got them, but these are the Star Trek annuals of the 70s, which are clearly, they've been well loved. Now, these, to me, really summon up the magic of Star Trek. In the same way that the 70s cartoon does, that real promise of sending you to a different world. These are reprints of the Gold Key comics of the 60s and 70s. It's a very particular kind of artwork. I'm kind of slightly disparaged, I suppose, because they're not quite on message. They go off in their own direction, a bit like the Doctor Who annuals. But for me, there's something magical about them. These are all graffitied by some previous owner. Still worth having, though. To me, it's still magic. I quite like the fact that they deviate slightly from the TV show. There's more monsters, there's more melodrama than the show. Better, bigger effects, because they're drawn. This is 1978. This is the bit I remember. For some reason this stuck with me in 1978 when I was 8 or 9, the bit where all the crew members have to strip off and take a shower together because they're having some kind of decontamination steri bath, and it was a bit rude. I remember that very clearly. So I've got some of them still to go back to. I know they've reprinted all of the Gold Key comics. What I'd love to have is actual issues of Gold Key, because the smell of comics from that time is very, very particular. Gold Key comics and Charlton comics appeared in newsagents in Darlington when I was a kid, just for a few years, and they seemed so American and so archaic. They seemed to come from a different era. And I remember them having stories about cavemen and dinosaurs and time travel and other planets with these beautiful painted covers. And they seemed even more exotic than DC and Marvel comics. What is it, sucks? Now, also in 84, there was the Vonda N McIntyre novelizations of the movies. Now, she was a wonderful science fiction writer in her own right, like James Blish. One of the things that Star Trek books always seem to have done is use writers who have careers elsewhere, often science fiction writers who have their own series and their own universes. And they are kind of scribes for hire within the Star Trek world. Vonda N McIntyre brought a very particular atmosphere and continuity to her corner of the Star Trek universe. They're like nobody else's books. I think her first is The Entropy Effect, which I haven't picked out actually yet here today. And I read that, I think, from the library, and then she novelised The Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, and I think The Voyage Home, and they became a kind of trilogy by themselves. This came out before the movie, and I was so entrenched in Star Trek books by then, by the summer of 84, that I couldn't put it down. I bought it at the beginning of a day out. It was the very beginning of a day out. We were driving to the Lake District, and I didn't put it down all day. Wherever we went, whichever lake we sat by, wherever we had fish and chips, all the hills we drove around, I was sat in the back of the car with a search for Spock, desperate to find out if they were going to find him by the end. And they seemed such grown-up books as well. She dignified all the characters with proper grown-up backstories, all of them, and in a way that the films didn't particularly. Yeah, I'd recommend her rewrites of all of that stuff. What a talent. And what else? At that time, Corgi ran out of stories to adapt from TV, and so James Blish was the first to do an original Star Trek novel, and Spock Must Die! ! Pulled together everything he knew about Star Trek from having adapted all the episodes, and I haven't reread this since the time. I never really see people talk about it much, but he just had the voices of the characters beautifully. And I think there's two Spocks in this, isn't there? It's to do with the transporter accident. I must reread it. That's a great one to revisit, actually. What else? Have I got any more from then? Oh, yes. Trek to Mad World, which for many, many years was my favourite. It's the kind of 5 Doctors of Star Trek, because it pulls together. Yeah, 84 it was reprinted. I would have read it that first year. Pulls together characters from all over the universe, their villains from different episodes, and puts them in this strange world, a kind of metafictional world outside the universe that's very theatrical, with actual kind of theatre curtains, and they go behind the scenes, and there's some godlike being, of course, pulling all the strings. Another one to reread, I think, rather than branching out and discovering the more recent stuff. What I should do is return to especially these two. I haven't picked out Spock Messiah, which is the strangest of all of them, and I've got a beautiful 70s edition that looks like a Frank Herbert novel, with Spock being all spooky on the front. I can't get up now because Socks is on my lap. You'll have to imagine it. There's another one. There was something about these novels that became slightly mystical at times, and I liked that. They transcended their TV and film origins by going into quite strange areas of science fiction, transcendental bits of science fiction, and I like that. Quite philosophical. Here's a philosophical one, my favourite of all, which I didn't read until the 2000s, but it belongs to the early 80s, and I wish I'd read it then. Melinda Snodgrass's The Tears of the Singers, and I've talked about this on other videos before, so you might have seen me enthuse about this book before, but it's the one about Uhura going to the planet of the seals that weep jewels when they're killed. And so the Klingons are happily clubbing their way through this world of singing seals. And of course, that inevitably disrupts the harmony of the universe, which depends upon the seals, of course. And with her new boyfriend, who is a lot like Rick Wakeman from Yes, because he plays the organ and dresses up as a kind of glam rock wizard, Uhura runs off to go and save the seals, while Kirk and Spock are fighting Klingons. One of the best ever, and I used to read that every Christmas. I used to reread it. Here's another Vonda N. McIntyre from the 80s, which was her imagining the beginning of the original 5-year mission. I think it's been, like all these things, get decanonized and written out of existence by subsequent versions, the movies, the prequels, all of that stuff. But this was hypostasized, is the actual word, I think, version of their beginnings that would belong to her trilogy, her later novels, or her earlier novels. The version of the characters we know from her novels, like The Search for Spock and The Entropy Effect, are projected backwards, and this is what we get. Enterprise, the first adventure, which I remember being fantastic. Here's Gene Roddenberry's novelization of the movie. I can't remember if he actually wrote it or not, or if it's Alan Dean Foster. Usually you get a filmmaker's name on the front of these books, and it's actually written by Alan Dean Foster. I remember reading this at 14 and being amazed at a section in which Kirk seems to respond to readers' letters about him and Spock and had they ever been lovers. And this is the classic case, the classic moment when Kirk tells everyone that he wouldn't be so foolish as to fall in love with someone who only got sexy every 7 years, which is a very funny reply. Right, what else? More original novels that I've loved and kept. I've read a lot, and I don't hold on to, I don't treasure all of them, I have to say, but certain ones I do. The Galactic Whirlpool by David Gerrold, again with one of those very epic covers that usually involve planets and space stations and a tiny enterprise. Yesterday's Sun, A.C. Crispin. It's not a proper Star Trek video if I don't talk about her work. She wrote a handful of these, a bunch of these, and she was a wonderful writer. I read her books in all different areas, in her Star Trek books, her Star Wars novels, her own series, Starbridge as well. I've read some of those. They're quite hard to get hold of. As I've said before, it was the women who made the original Star Trek novels work. Often Diane Duane, Melinda Snodgrass, A.C. Crispin, Vonda McIntyre, they're the ones who make it work. I love that cover. Kathleen Sky, Death's Angel. Yes, I love this one as well. There's a reason I hang on to things and a reason they go into the permanent bookcase. Now, these, I haven't got a whole set of these, but this is like another sequence of adaptations where Alan Dean Foster, the sainted Alan Dean Foster, takes the cartoon series of the 70s, a series which I love. I really love that cartoon series. I remember it from the time and watching it alongside other Filmation shows like Planet of the Apes and Tarzan, where all the monsters sounded the same. They had the same roar. All the characters ran across the screen in the same way. And the musical cues were the same. They just reused them for each show. I wish there'd been a mashup at some point of Star Trek, Planet of the Apes and Tarzan. That would have been an amazing animated feature film. I know there's been a comic series in recent years bringing together Star Trek and Planet of the Apes. I'm sure somebody's had the same thought process as I have. Anyway, the cartoon series is great, but they're just 20-minute episodes and slightly limited by the scope of what Filmation could pull off. But giving them to Alan Dean Foster was a masterstroke. I've got volumes 2 through to 6, and I know there was more. They were really poorly served with covers in this series. I know there's a more exciting set you can get. These are reprints from the look at that, it's from Timeslip. £2.10 from Timeslip. I bet this comes from the time of the reprinting. 87, yep. See, he would do 3 episodes and make a huge novel out of them. So there was a lot of ground to cover, and he gives further background to some of the new characters, like the is it Maress, the lion lady, and the fellow with 3 arms. They all get a bit more to do, and it feels a bit like how Discovery and Strange New Worlds feel on TV. In some ways, they're doing this, I think. And 6 and 5, they're so boring, these covers. I will have to go on eBay and look for the fancier ones and look for the extra volumes. I love the fact that the stories get longer and longer as he goes on, as if he can't quite let them go. He's got to make the most of them before the material vanishes, before he runs out of episodes to adapt. And of course, back in those days, it felt finite. It felt like a finite universe. And of course, now there's so much Star Trek, you could never hope to kind of cope with it all. And I don't really want to. I like the bits that I want to return to, I think. Although, having said that, I'm thinking about other things that I've dipped into in recent years. There was a lovely book by Una McCormack for Picard, which was unusual because it was more exciting than the first season of Picard, about the Romulan homeworld exploding and a robot revolt on Mars and Picard losing his reputation. It's all the backstory to the original first series of Picard. And very oddly, the TV show went with a much duller story afterwards. I could never understand that. Una must have been punching the air when she realised what her novel was going to be allowed to be about, because usually tie-in novels aren't allowed to advance the main plot of a series. They happen in the margins often, but not in that case. Anyway, there have been recent ones that I've liked, and maybe I should read some of the tie-ins for Strange New Worlds. Maybe I'll look into that. Anyway, that's long enough on Star Trek. Everybody else, if you're not bothered about Star Trek, you can come back in now. Anyway, goodbye. I hope you're all well. Do like and subscribe and stuff below, and I will see you again in the next episode. Goodbye.